Come cucini il riso?
How do you cook rice? How do you cook rice?
Come lavi i vestiti?
How do you wash clothes? How do you wash clothes?
Come ripari una gomma?
How do you fix a tire? How do you fix a tire?
Come invii email?
How do you send email? How do you send email?
Come prepari il tè?
How do you make tea? How do you make tea?
Come allacci le scarpe?
How do you tie shoes? How do you tie shoes?
Come viaggi a buon mercato?
How do you travel cheaply? How do you travel cheaply?
Come pulisci le finestre?
How do you clean windows? How do you clean windows?
Come avvii l'auto?
How do you start a car? How do you start a car?
Come scrivi codice?
How do you write code? How do you write code?
Come disegni un gatto?
How do you draw a cat? How do you draw a cat?
Come sollevi scatole?
How do you lift boxes? How do you lift boxes?
Come nutri gli animali?
How do you feed pets? How do you feed pets?
Come accendi un fuoco?
How do you build a fire? How do you build a fire?
Come risparmi denaro?
How do you save money? How do you save money?
Come impari inglese?
How do you learn English? How do you learn English?
Come apri le porte?
How do you open doors? How do you open doors?
Come coltivi piante?
How do you grow plants? How do you grow plants?
Come trovi le chiavi?
How do you find keys? How do you find keys?
Come leggi mappe?
How do you read maps? How do you read maps?
Come bolli l'acqua?
How do you boil water? How do you boil water?
Come carichi il tuo telefono?
How do you charge your phone? How do you charge your phone?
Come imposti una sveglia?
How do you set an alarm? How do you set an alarm?
Come invii un messaggio?
How do you send a text? How do you send a text?
Come paghi le bollette?
How do you pay bills? How do you pay bills?
Come lavi i piatti?
How do you wash dishes? How do you wash dishes?
Come annodi la cravatta?
How do you tie your tie? How do you tie your tie?
Come fai la valigia?
How do you pack a suitcase? How do you pack a suitcase?
Come apri un barattolo?
How do you open a jar? How do you open a jar?
Come chiudi la porta?
How do you close the door? How do you close the door?
Come cambi una lampadina?
How do you change a bulb? How do you change a bulb?
Come ti lavi i denti?
How do you brush your teeth? How do you brush your teeth?
Come pieghi i vestiti?
How do you fold clothes? How do you fold clothes?
Come scrivi una lettera?
How do you write a letter? How do you write a letter?
Come prendi un autobus?
How do you catch a bus? How do you catch a bus?
Come prenoti un volo?
How do you book a flight? How do you book a flight?
Come pulisci il pavimento?
How do you clean the floor? How do you clean the floor?
Come chiudi a chiave la porta?
How do you lock the door? How do you lock the door?
Come annaffi le piante?
How do you water the plants? How do you water the plants?
Come organizzi la tua scrivania?
How do you organize your desk? How do you organize your desk?